outlook wasn't brilliant for the Mudville Nine that day. The score stood 4-2, with but one inning more to play. And then when Cooney died at first and Barrows did the same, a pall-like silence fell upon the patrons of the game. A straggling few got up to go in deep despair. The rest clung to that hope which springs eternal in the human breast. They thought, if only Casey could get a whack at that, we'd put up even money now with Casey at the bat. Well, those are the first two stanzas, of course, of Casey at the Bat, the 1888 poem about baseball. And we have an opinion about baseball this week, and one about wild horses, here on Short Circuit, your podcast on the Federal Courts of Appeals. I'm your host, Anthony Sanders, director of the Center for Judicial Engagements at the Institute for Justice. We're recording this on Wednesday, July 30th, 2025. We have a wee show today, a relaxed show, where I have my friend and colleague Rob Johnson on, and me, just the two of us, where we're going to talk a little baseball, a little wild horses, a little admin law, antitrust. It's kind of a few old goodies here today. And also we're going to have a Where Are They Now at the end. So if you're interested in what's happened in some cases we've talked about in the past, a little bit of an update at the end of the show. And before I introduce Rob and his baseball, we're going to just tell you about a couple things coming up. So one I've discussed on the show before, and that is our 7th Circuit special that we have in Chicago. That is on August 17th, Sunday at 7 p.m. at the Swiss Hotel in downtown Chicago. There's a link in the show notes to give you the details, but basically if you show up at that time, it's a free event. You get to see a free Short Circuit Live with some 7th Circuit specialists. And also, we have a event on September 15th at Yimbitown. So Yimbitown is, you might tell from the title, is a conference of people into the YIMBY movement, the Yes in My Backyard movement, the movement about using property rights to build things for people. Housing is what it's usually called. And so we're going to be there at Yimbitown, which is in New Haven, Connecticut. So you have to go to the conference to go to this live show. But if you are going to that conference, or you're in the New Haven, Connecticut area and you'd like to go, then you can come see a Short Circuit Live where it'll be me, my colleague Ari Bargill, David Schleicher, who's a professor at Yale Law School, and Andrew Fine, who is at Open New York. And it will be a fun YIMBY time about some recent cases related to YIMBY issues. Today, though, we got Rob Johnson and baseball. So Rob, I know you're a baseball fan. Now, are you not really? Kind of?
Shaking my head over here.
Oh,
no.
Man.
I know. I'm like the wrong person to talk about this case.
Well, I mean, I know you're into the Browns.
Yeah, that's a football team, though.
Right. Well, I know. So I figured like you were kind of a Guardians, Indians, whatever you want to call it. But not so much.
If I had to pick a team, it'd be the Orioles.
Okay.
But
okay.
No, I'm not a baseball fan.
All right. Well, maybe you're an objective observer then. See, so I am a longtime Seattle Mariners fan. I also root for the Twins. I live in Minnesota. Not when they play each other, though. But so I'm guessing you're not a baseball fan, super baseball fan at least. And I'm guessing you're also not a Puerto Rican baseball fan.
No, I'm like the last person who should be talking about this case, really. But you're right. Maybe objective observer is right, and maybe that's what this case needs because it's a little wacky. Yeah.
Well, so this is about a Puerto Rican baseball league. I didn't even know is a thing, but it doesn't surprise me. There's a league of baseball teams in Puerto Rico. Like many sports league, they have some internal strife. And then there's this question about antitrust. Well, let me ask you this. So you worked in big law, as they say. Did you do any antitrust work there?
Ooh. No, but I did represent the NFL Players Association.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, maybe we can get into the whole like antitrust and union stuff, which is interesting. It's not in this case, but it's interesting. Well, but instead of me blathering on, you take your objective assessment of this Puerto Rico baseball antitrust, and also people who are students of law and baseball will know this old kind of exception in antitrust law that relates to the business of baseball.
Okay, so this case involves a storied Puerto Rican baseball team that's located in San Juan, called and I don't speak Spanish either, so this is just terrible. It's called the Cangrejeros de Santurce, and I have no idea if I pronounced that right.
Apologies to everyone who can pronounce Spanish names, let alone everyone who can speak Spanish. We're going to make our way through this.
Yes, and apparently that translates as the Crab Fishermen, which is a great name for a team.
It is.
According to Wikipedia, my go-to source, this team is famous for its 1954 Panic Squad, which included Willie Mays and also Roberto Clemente.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They would play in the winter, so Willie Mays was down there in the winter. Clemente hadn't made it big yet. So, but very famous. We've all heard of it. The owner of this team decided he did not like the stadium that they were playing in. This is obviously happens all the time. He didn't like the stadium.
Very familiar.
Yeah, especially to us Browns fans. The owner did not like the stadium, and he threatened to move out of San Juan to another city. The league was not happy. The mayor was not happy. And so the league and the mayor get together, and they hatch a plot to basically stop the team from moving. The league first suspends the owner from baseball for 2 years. And when I say the league, obviously this is not the MLB. This is a Puerto Rican league.
Right.
They suspend the owner for 2 years. And so then the owner sues to challenge his suspension. And then the league says, oh, well, you sued us. That's a breach of your franchise agreement. And so they terminate the franchise agreement, take away the team from the owner, and pay him no compensation.
That part is so harsh. Like,
yes.
How could that be legal under their contract?
I mean, that's a very good question. but that turns out is not what the case is about. So the owner sues. He sues, and he brings, really for our purposes, 3 claims. And the first of the 3 claims is a federal Sherman Act claim. And he says that the league is violating federal antitrust law through this kind of anti-competitive behavior. I'm not sure about that claim just on the merits, right? Like, does this seems like illegal in lots of ways, but is it an antitrust violation? I'm not sure.
Right.
We'll never know, because it turns out that claim is barred at the very outset under what is called the business of baseball exception to the federal antitrust laws. And this one is basically kind of like baseball. It's more about history than it is about anything that is sort of logical or makes sense.
This is like the most history and tradition of history and traditions, I think.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of like why I'm not a baseball fan, right? Like, you go to a baseball game, and it's like more about the history and tradition than it is about like anything else. It's like we have to stand at this point and sing this song, and like just because people have been doing this for,
you don't like the song, man.
It's just,
I hear everyone hitting
baseball
next on their podcast apps right now.
Yeah, sorry. Anyway, this is my hot take on baseball. But so, probably as befits baseball, it turns out that the law around baseball is all about history and tradition. We have this 1922 case called the Federal Baseball Club of Baltimore. And this is a case where the National and American leagues were beating up on a third league, the poor old Federal League, and they basically drove it out of existence. And so the Federal League sued and said, oh, you're violating the federal antitrust laws, which actually does sound like an antitrust claim. And Justice Holmes read an opinion where he says that the Sherman Act does not apply to baseball. And the reason he gives is that baseball is not interstate commerce. He says even though the teams are crossing state lines to play, the game itself occurs within state lines and is not itself interstate commerce. And the fact that you cross state lines to engage in commerce in a state doesn't make it interstate commerce. Anybody who knows anything about the Commerce Clause would say, like, that's obviously not how the Commerce Clause works these days. Like, these days, everything's interstate commerce. But that was 1922, and it was a different era. And that was sort of the thinking at the time. And constitutionally, probably was the correct thinking, but that's a whole nother issue. Fast forward, the Commerce Clause obviously changes quite a bit. And, we get to the modern era where baseball sort of clearly is interstate commerce. And then that issue comes back to the Supreme Court in 1972 in a case called Flood, which is a challenge to the baseball reserve system. Basically, like, that baseball players are forever wedded to a particular team and have no right to, put their services out on a free market. And the Supreme Court basically says, yeah, we recognize that the holding of this 1922 case doesn't comport with the law anymore, but stare decisis, we're just going to leave it on the books. The Sherman Act does not apply to the business of baseball. So then you get this business of baseball decision, which is purely a matter of tradition, stare decisis, what have you. And the question in this First Circuit case is, does that business of baseball exception apply to just Major League Baseball? Or does it apply to baseball generally? Any baseball, anybody
Right.
who might be playing baseball. And the First Circuit says that, well, the decision doesn't just talk about the MLB, it talks about baseball. So the business of baseball exception does apply to this Puerto Rican Baseball League. Why does this make sense? Who knows, right? Like, the whole thing doesn't make sense. It's all just about history. I guess the history is not limited to the MLB, so neither is the business of baseball exception. None of it really makes sense. The oddity of this is that every other league is not subject to this exception, and yet all the other leagues seem to be fine.
Well, they all have players' unions.
Well, sure.
That's how they get around the antitrust laws.
Well, that, and also the courts apply the antitrust laws in a very flexible way to all these.
True. Yeah.
And they allow revenue sharing. They allow, there's all kinds of things that the NFL does that are, you could argue are anti-competitive, right?
Well, they are, and so not to just segue out of we want to get back to Puerto Rican baseball, but you represented the NFL Players Union, and so because it is a multi-employer bargaining union, which bargains with the NFL and multi-employer owner association, there are things they can do in that relationship that would otherwise be an antitrust violation. And so that's why, like, a few years ago, the players disbanded their union and then sued the NFL for antitrust violations, like literally the next day or that day. And they could do that because, like, that's how they get around the antitrust. Now, baseball itself has a union also, of course. So it's not like, it's just, that shows like that's one way to get around the antitrust stuff.
Yeah, and the other thing that courts have said in like cases involving the NFL is basically, look, this is a business where part of, the teams are competing against each other, but they're also cooperating, right? They're all part of the same venture, which is the league. And the league is kind of a joint venture where we all rise or fall together. So teams will do things that seem kind of irrational in their own self-interest, like agree to salary caps, agree to revenue sharing,
right,
where teams in big markets will send money to teams in small markets, and they do this because nobody wants to watch a sport where it's just like New York beating up on everybody else, like baseball.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Mets fans would disagree with you, but yeah,
fair enough. So anyway, there we have it. Business of baseball is baseball, not just Major League Baseball. But then the next wrinkle is they have another claim, which is a state antitrust claim. And so the question is that claim barred? And so here we go back to that 1972 case called Flood, where the Supreme Court had said that not only was the federal Sherman Act claim barred by the business of baseball exception, but also a state antitrust claim against the reserve system was also barred. And so then the question in this First Circuit case becomes, what was the reason that the state claim was barred in flood, and does it apply here? And the court basically goes through a close reading of flood, and it says, all right, we've determined that the rationale of flood was that the state antitrust claim was barred under the Commerce Clause. And so basically, not preemption, right? So it's not that the Sherman Act preempts state antitrust law. And in fact, state antitrust law doesn't, or the Sherman Act doesn't apply to baseball. So it'd be kind of weird if it preempted.
Right.
So it's a Commerce Clause analysis. Basically, the Commerce Clause, dormant Commerce Clause. So, state law is preempted if it impermissibly burdens interstate commerce. And so the rationale of flood is that baseball is so inherently interstate because their teams are all competing across state lines that if you had state antitrust law, that would so clearly interfere with interstate commerce that it's barred by the Commerce Clause. Which, if you recall the 1922 case, this is crazy.
That's
right?
Exactly the opposite.
Yeah, we have 1922. This has nothing to do with interstate commerce. 1972, suddenly it's so integrally related with interstate commerce that it can't be regulated by the states at all. Does that make sense? No, but here we are. So the First Circuit then says, okay, so that's the rationale of this 1972 case. So that brings us to this question here, after yet another half century of, is a solely Puerto Rican baseball team so related to interstate commerce that the application of Puerto Rican law to this Puerto Rican league would violate the dormant Commerce Clause? And the First Circuit says, we don't know. We're going to remand on that question. And so we will find out.
It sounds so wrong for so many reasons. I like the dormant Commerce Clause in some ways, but this just sounds nuts that you would claim that this interferes with interstate commerce.
Yes. I mean, we're talking about a league in Puerto Rico that has nothing to do. Honestly, kind of going back to the 1922 case, it sort of feels like the right answer here is that a purely Puerto Rican baseball team has nothing to do with interstate commerce at all. So maybe the Sherman Act shouldn't apply for that reason. But, nobody's making that argument.
Right.
So, okay, so state claim maybe can go forward. And then the last claim is a claim under Section 1983, because you have the mayor who is allegedly involved in all of this. He's a state actor. And so they brought a 1983 claim against the mayor. And the lower court had found that claim was barred by res judicata because the mayor had earlier brought his state law claims or Puerto Rican law claims challenging his suspension. And the court says, well, that is a judgment that bars this 1983 claim. And it turns out that the district court, when it did that, was applying an old Puerto Rican law that's no longer on the books. And nobody pointed this out to the district court. The district court didn't realize it. And then on appeal, the parties were like, oh, yeah, that law is not a real law anymore. But you should have, and the defendant said, yeah, but you should affirm on other grounds, right? We have all these other reasons you should affirm. And the First Circuit basically is like, look, the only reason that the district court gave for its decision was this old law that no longer applies. So we're going to vacate that and send that back down, and you can argue in the district court. So basically, you have two claims, both of which are applying like century or half-century old precedents that make no sense. And then you have a third claim that was dismissed based on a law that's no longer in force, does not exist. It's very baseball.
It's very common law of baseball. We do it because we've always done it that way.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's a lot actually going on in this case that we could spend a long time talking about. I just find the business of baseball parsing of Flood v. Kuhn, the 1972 case, super interesting, because when you're reading Flood v. Kuhn and you know anything about American sports, you're assuming they're talking about Major League Baseball. the first, and I haven't gone back and parsed Flood v. Kuhn, but the First Circuit is saying actually they never say that this reasoning, and this reasoning, which is based on history and tradition, is only applied to Major League Baseball, as in the American and National Leagues. It applies to the business of baseball generally, which I gotta say is a bit of a stretch. I don't quite know why they were doing it. I think probably one reason, if you want to be a little cynical, is that if they did get into an actual antitrust claim, that gets really complicated. And so and this Puerto Rican antitrust claim is there anyway. So why not just remand and have the district court, get into that stuff? It's going to be a lot easier.
I also just get the sense that like maybe one thing that's lurking here is what happened factually is just pretty egregious. Like, sounds like they basically just stole this guy's team. And you kind of get the sense it's like, well, we got to be faithful to this business of baseball exception, but this guy got screwed and he's going to get some sort of a remedy. Or at least we're not going to foreclose that he will.
Yeah. Well, maybe he will. It goes back to district court in Puerto Rico. And so I don't know if this would have legs beyond where it is now. I don't know if there's other small baseball leagues around the country that are crying out for antitrust protection or not having antitrust protection. And so there would be some kind of a split brewing. I really doubt it.
So there's this whole discussion about this other opinion called Christ, which is from the 11th Circuit. And Christ, it says, concluded that that Flood's discussion of state law was not based on Commerce Clause at all, but was based on preemption. And under that view, the Sherman Act preempts any state claims. So there is maybe a split.
Well, yeah. So you're saying on more the dormant Commerce Clause or preemption, yes, whatever we want to call it, angle.
Yeah. So if anyone's listening who's one of these people who's looking for splits, there is maybe a split. So,
yeah. I mean,
I didn't even get to that.
The thing is that the whole deal is the reasoning is pretty insane from the Flood case that just, no one was worried about at the time, because if you say, well, state law affects an interstate industry, that's most state laws.
Yeah.
That's all kinds of, like, even stuff that, hardcore, originalists would think, well, even that is interstate commerce. Like, a state law affecting railroads in some way. There's a lot of preemption in that area anyway. But if you say, like, just because an industry crosses state lines, the state law, even if it's, neutrally applied and it has nothing to do with discrimination against out-of-state entities, that's like massive dormant Commerce Clause. And so I can see why, that was avoided by the First Circuit.
Yes.
Well, I hope all of you enjoyed the baseball, even if it's not, Rob's favorite sport. But we're going to move now to something that, Rob, do you like horses?
I do. I like wild horses too.
Okay, cool. So you hopefully will enjoy this. And this combines something that we've actually talked about recently on the show, which is the checkerboard pattern of land in the Western United States, which comes out of not really tradition, but some history that we discussed in a show about trespassing in Wyoming for hunters a few months back with our colleague Dan Nelson discussed it. And we're going to bring back that kind of property wrinkle and combine it with wild horses. So I will first I'll talk about the kind of property background, and then I will get into the wild horses, and then say what the 10th Circuit said about the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Bueros Act of 1971 and subsequent amendments. So if you remember from that episode, how the West was won, right? How the native peoples were shoved off their land and the railroads were built, and eventually we got states and all that, was part of that was the intercontinental railroads. And so when a railroad was built, the federal government would give the railroad land on either side of the railroad, and then in a checkerboard pattern. So think of like a literal checkerboard where you have red squares and black squares. The federal government would get one color, and then they'd sell off to private owners, or the railroad would get the other color. And the thinking was eventually these will all get sold off as the land is developed, and the federal government will sell the land off. In a lot of places, that's what happened. But in southern arid Wyoming, no one really wants that land other than some ranchers. And so the land is the land of one part of the checkerboard is privately owned, but not a lot going on there. There is some ranching, a little bit of maybe renting it out for hunting, camping, that kind of thing. And then the federal government owns the other lands, and the federal government through the Bureau of Land Management does stuff with the land and does lease it out for ranching and whatever else. But yeah, it's pretty underpopulated land. So then you have these wild horses. All right, so now we're going to have to take a step back that I think maybe explains the case, some of the background of the case that the case doesn't talk about, but I think that's probably because the 10th Circuit has addressed this issue of wild horses a few times, and so it didn't get really into the weeds. So 500 years ago, there were no wild horses in North America. There were horses or things that you would probably call a horse a long time ago. Like we're talking in the Ice Age. And then sometime during the Holocene, the period after the Ice Age, so 10,000 years ago, a little more recent than that even, but still thousands of years ago, those horse creatures are related to the modern horse, but not the same thing. They died out. And they died out with a lot of other megafauna that died out at that time. People argue about whether it's the when native peoples came from Eurasia and populated the Americas is because they got hunted out, or whether it was climate change, or you can make arguments, whatever. There used to be horses, there weren't anymore. Okay, thousands of years go by. But then the Europeans come and they bring their horses. And so you get in, say, the 1600s, you start to get horses in the West that were first brought by the Spanish. A lot of the native tribes adopted them, right? They said like, wow, you can get around a lot faster with a horse. You can hunt buffalo a lot better with a horse. And so that's where we get kind of the plains culture with all, with them riding horses that we're familiar with more recent history. And you also get wild horses as part of that, as you often get with domesticated animals that go feral. So there were huge herds of wild horses all over the West in the 19th century. By the 20th century, though, because of partly development and also just horses as domesticated, of course, weren't as much a thing with the coming of the automobile. You have less and less horses. And so then people start to get worried about, like they do it with other environmental causes, with less wild horses. Now, I would say, and some other people have said, are they really wild horses? Like they're feral. They're not exactly native, but then people might say, well, maybe it's kind of more like the original environment thousands of years ago, and they're just like brought back. They're a different kind of horse, but they're brought back. So you can make arguments either way, but that all doesn't really matter because Congress spoke. Like some horse lovers got to Congress and got this law passed in 1971 to protect wild horses. So apparently after the wild horse population was really in decline, just a few tens of thousands all over the country. After this law is passed, they like explode wild horses, Mustangs. I'm saying wild horses, but if you know about Mustangs, it's the same thing. Also barrows, which, wild donkeys, but it's mostly horses. So then Congress has to act again. In the late 70s, they pass some amendments, and basically they tell the Bureau of Land Management to try to balance the environment with horses. Yeah, you all got all this other stuff going on with federal lands, but we want you to also focus on horses and make sure they're protected. So what eventually happens is there are some areas where it's okay for the horses to go, but the Bureau of Land Management doesn't try to protect them. There's other areas, though, where they actively do things to try to keep the horse population robust, right? But not too much. So that can mean things like a little managing the land, make sure there's enough water, but not too many horses because then they might take too much water. And also, of course, there's balancing with other interests, whether it's the ecology to get overpopulated or it's grazing that ranchers need. So you got to balance all those things. And then on top of that,
just to interject something here. I was reading about this before the show. So I don't know if you know this. The Bureau of Land Management, because these horses breed, right?
Right.
So there are too many, right? They just keep breeding and breeding. So the Bureau of Land Management will do roundups. Well, they'll take some of them off of the public lands, and then they store them in like pastures, right?
Right.
After they've taken them off the land, because they're not going to kill them, because everyone would get mad about that. So the Bureau of Land Management currently holds 68,000 wild horses in pastures. And this is a trivia question. Do you know what the annual cost is for the Bureau of Land Management to house and feed those horses?
So I did know about how they took some off the land and had these pastures, but I don't know how much it costs. I'm guessing it's a lot of money.
It's over $100 million a year.
Wow.
Just to keep these wild horses in a domesticated, non-wild corral.
And I'm guessing people don't really want them because it's hard to tame a feral horse rather than just buy a regular horse.
They're useless. And they're not wild. I mean, these ones, some are, right? The ones you're talking about, but these are like close to 78,000 quote unquote wild horses that have been taken and put in a corral, and we pay $100 million a year to feed them.
It's our strategic horse reserve.
This is crazy. Anyway, I interrupted.
Well, no. So that kind of just adds to, you might say, the insanity that Congress has foisted upon the Bureau of Land Management. And I got to say, we often criticize bureaucracies and bureaucrats on this show, but I feel for these guys who are trying to manage these dictates from Congress that don't make any sense, that contradict each other. So add all to that with the horses that are still wild, so not the ones Rob was talking about that are no longer wild. You have this checkerboard pattern. So the courses, of course, they run all over the place, including on the parts of the checkerboard that are privately owned. Now, that's fine as long as the landowners are cool with the horses going through. And also, they can't, if they're not cool with it, they can't fence them off, because there are other laws that say you can't just fence off wild animals, including horses, running through your wilderness. And, I kind of, even as someone who believes in property rights, I kind of get that, because it's kind of just the natural state of things is these animals running through. It's kind of like you can't just dam a river, right? And because then people downstream wouldn't get their water. Well, we don't have the wild animals elsewhere if you do that. So, but they can, the law says they can object to the horses being on their pasture. And if they do so, the Bureau of Land Management has to come and take them away. So you could say, oh, they ran through my checkerboard again. Come and take them away. They're not getting off. And the Bureau, so this was happening anyway. And somehow they tried to work things out with, and this is one particular area of Wyoming, where most of the land is owned by one grazing association. So the grazing association was working with them in this impossible situation, right, for a while. And then in about 15 years ago, they relinquished their permission. They said, no more horses on our land. So, of course, at that point, BLM has to start picking up the horses. But they say, we don't have the money. We don't, well, probably because they're spending them all in the corrals that Rob just talked about. But we don't have the money to go get all these horses. And so they sue. And so there's been ongoing litigation. There was a settlement agreement reached back in the Obama administration about how they're going to do this. But then the horse lover groups, they don't like what the settlement is. So they get involved. So you have on all different sides, you have the BLM kind of caught in the middle, the feds. Then you have the grazers, and then the state of Wyoming, which is on the side of the grazers. And then you have the kind of more environmental groups, or I don't even know if they're strictly speaking environmental groups, the horse lover groups on the other side. And they're all fighting each other. So how do we come up with this? So the what happens at this stage of the case is the district court says that a new plan that BLM came up where they tried to balance all this stuff. They said, this is our plan. And the district court said, that is fine. So it's challenged under the Administrative Procedure Act. And the court says, no, this is okay. So the environmental groups appeal at the 10th Circuit. And so this all comes down to, there's some other stuff going on, but really it comes down to two sections of the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act. First of all, it's the secretary shall manage wild free roaming horses and burros in a manner that is designed to achieve and maintain a thriving natural ecological balance. Okay. Then there's this other thing that I alluded to. If wild free roaming horses or burros stray from public lands onto privately owned land, the owners of such land may inform the nearest federal marshal or agents of the secretary who shall arrange to have the animals removed. And so the court says, since wild horses constantly move on and off private and public land on the checkerboard, complying with both commands is particularly difficult. So the court really wants to rule to say this compromise, let it go forward. But the problem is the act says what it says. It says shall manage wild free horses and burros with a thriving natural ecological balance. And when BLM went through and adopted this latest plan, they didn't do that. They don't even really, comment on it as part of their notice and comment when you as part of this APA procedure that always happens with these things. And so the 10th Circuit says, we're going to remand. You need to do it over, but nudge, nudge, wink, wink. If you do that, we're going to be easy on you, and we think this is going to go. This will be okay because we realize you're kind of in an impossible situation. And so that's the end. There's some other stuff going on, but that's basically the long and short of it is they remand for a do-over. But there's basically no long-term solution to this because of how the property is and because of the interests involved and mostly because Congress has asked for something that can't be done.
Yeah, I love this just because it shows how there's just this tendency to think that nature, you pick a particular point in time and that's what nature should be. Right. So this whole idea of wild horses is just absurd because there's no natural state of having wild horses, or maybe there is. Who knows, right? Is the natural state before Columbus arrived or after Columbus arrived? Who knows? I do think wild horses are cool though. So I'd like them to be somewhere. Maybe not in this area, but somewhere.
Yeah, and I think they're even more in Nevada, but they don't. They probably have their own issues in Nevada, but there's not quite this checkerboard of horses thing. And then, of course, there's many in these non-wild corrals. So if you want to see wild horses, it's probably the easiest way to do it is to go to those corrals.
Sure.
So we wish the Bureau of Land Management well in trying to deal with those wild horses, and for all those wild horse lovers out there, we hope you like this update. We're going to now end with some updates on past cases that we've talked about on Short Circuit, including a couple that we've been waiting a long time for some news, and now we have a little bit. So this one really stuck with me, which we talked about just about a year ago, Gilmore versus Georgia Department of Corrections. This was really ugly behavior by some prison officials where a woman wanted to visit her boyfriend in jail. And she gets to the jail and they say, you have to do a strip search right now where we're going to see if, you're bringing something into him. And if you refuse, you will never see him again. And all this other bad stuff is going to happen to you. Not like, well, if you want to see him, we have to do a strip search. It was like, you're here now and we're going to do the strip search. So she sued, said that it's unconstitutional. And the 11th Circuit panel was stuck with some not great 11th Circuit case law and said, this we're gonna say there's qualified immunity here, but we think this case should go en banc. And so it went en banc, and there was post-argument briefing because the court wanted more briefed on other issues. And basically, what happened was, and this was ruled on earlier in July 2025, is that the 11th Circuit said that now going forward, so not what our case law said, you can actually look at non-11th Circuit cases, so from other circuits, to see whether a law is clearly established for qualified immunity. So that's an improvement there. But how much you need to have, quote, obvious clarity, we're not going to tell you. We'll leave that for another day. But the law before that had arguably been, it's completely irrelevant if there's non-circuit case law. So that seems like a step in the right direction. Wouldn't you say, Rob? That was kind of a silly rule to begin with?
Yeah, sounds positive.
And they also said that, yes, she had her rights violated and it was clearly established. So in her individual situation, her case can go forward. But as far as the next one, it's going to depend. Also, we discussed a case, our colleague Bob McNamara presented it last fall about 11-member juries. So there was this jury where at the last minute, the last alternate was kicked off, and then one member of the jury had to be kicked off. So there were only 11, and whether you can convict with 11 members. So that the law is that you can, but the standard, they wondered what the standard is for reviewing that. And so the Second Circuit said it is not going to take the case en banc, although only on a 7-5 vote. And there are a lot of opinions in that mix of, whether we should take it or shouldn't take it, saying on whether how you review something that is not a constitutional right, but is nevertheless an error, and what, quote, harmless error is. And I'm not going to bore you with how all that came down, but essentially there is no, strictly speaking, constitutional right to a 12-member jury, like an absolute right. But is that a structural error? Is it reviewed for harmless error review? When is only structural errors are reviewed for a harmless error review? That's left for another day. But if you're interested in those issues, I encourage you to check it out. And finally, so we talked about this case involving property in Liechtenstein, the small principality in the Alps, where if you have trust money, it's a good place to hide it. And so the U.S. Government tried to go after, in the Ninth Circuit, this man's property in Liechtenstein. And you can go back, Short Circuit 350, if you want to hear the episode. But that went en banc, and there was a late-breaking, just in June, decision from the Supreme Court called Fold versus Palestine Liberation Organization. And this was about whether an act of Congress, a cause of action under that act of Congress, can go after the PLO's assets for terrorism. And the Supreme Court said that the reach of jurisdiction for the U.S. courts under the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment, which the PLO was trying to use to say you couldn't go after our assets, is more expansive than when you're talking about states and the 14th Amendment. So really what that means is the U.S. government can get some special treatment on jurisdiction. And they might be able to get this property after all. So the court asked for rebriefing on those issues, and we'll see what it says. But I think probably it sounds like, as often happens, the U.S. government eventually will be able to get the money in Liechtenstein.
So call your bankers in Liechtenstein.
Yeah, maybe not as safe as it used to be. And that is all the updates and where are they at now. So Rob, thank you for sticking with us, and thank you for your baseball report. I hope you guys enjoyed the wild horses. So I'm going to give a sign off in a minute, and then we're going to append it with a reading, full reading for those of you who want to hear of the poem we began with, Casey at the Bat, a classic piece of history and tradition of baseball in America that we're standing up for. If you haven't heard in a while, I encourage you to listen. If not, you can just hit play or hit stop and that call it a day. But it's from a wonderful place called LibriVox.org, where you have readings of poems and books and whatever in the public domain. And this particular reading was, there's a number of them because it's a popular poem at LibriVox, but this is one we took from there. I'll put a link in the show notes, but I think the guy does a great job. So we'll play it just after I sign off. But before that, please be sure to follow Short Circuit on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all other podcast platforms. And remember to get engaged.
Casey at the Bat by Ernest Lawrence Thayer. Read for LibriVox.org by Leonard Wilson of Springfield, Ohio. It looked extremely rocky for the Mudville Nine that day. The score stood 4-6 with just an inning left to play. And so when Cooney died at first and Burroughs did the same, a pallor wreathed the features of the patrons of the game. A straggling few got up to go, leaving there the rest, with that hope that springs eternal within the human breast. For they thought if only Casey could get one whack, at that they'd put up even money with Casey at the bat. But Flynn preceded Casey, and so likewise did Blake. But the former was a pudding, and the latter was a fake. So on that stricken multitude a death-like silence sat, for there seemed but little chance of Casey's getting to the bat. But Flynn let drive a single, to the wonderment of all, and the much-despised Blakey tore the cover off the ball. And when the dust had lifted, and they saw what had occurred, there was Blakey safe on second, and Flynn a hugging third. Then from the gladdened multitude went up a joyous yell. It bounded from the mountain top and rattled in the dell. It struck upon the hillside and rebounded on the flat. For Casey, mighty Casey, was advancing to the bat. There was ease in Casey's manner as he stepped into his place. There was pride in Casey's bearing, and a smile on Casey's face. And when, responding to the cheers, he lightly doffed his hat, no stranger in the crowd could doubt 'twas Casey at the bat. 10,000 eyes were on him as he rubbed his hands with dirt. 5,000 tongues applauded when he wiped them on his shirt. Then while the writhing pitcher ground the ball into his hip, defiance glanced in Casey's eye, a sneer curled Casey's lip. And now the leather-covered sphere came hurtling through the air, and Casey stood a-watching it in haughty grandeur there. Close by the sturdy batsman the ball unheeded sped. "That ain't my style," said Casey. "Strike one," the umpire said. From the benches black with people there went up a muffled roar, like the beating of the storm waves on a stern and distant shore. "Kill him! Kill the umpire!" shouted someone in the stand. And it's likely they'd have killed him had not Casey raised his hand. With the smile of Christian charity great Casey's visage shone. He stilled the rising tumult. He bade the game go on. He signaled to the pitcher, and once more the spheroid flew. But Casey still ignored it, and the umpire said, "Strike two." "Fraud!" cried the maddened thousands, and the echo answered, "Fraud!" But one scornful look from Casey, and the audience was awed. They saw his face grow stern and cold, they saw his muscles strain, and they knew that Casey wouldn't let that ball go by again. The sneer is gone from Casey's lip, his teeth are clenched with hate, he pounds with cruel violence his bat upon the plate. And now the pitcher holds the ball, and now he lets it go, and now the air is shattered by the force of Casey's blow. Oh, somewhere in this favored land the sun is shining bright. The band is playing somewhere, and somewhere hearts are light. And somewhere men are laughing, and somewhere children shout. But there is no joy in Mudville. Mighty Casey has struck out. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain.